Namaskar, welcome back to Media Scan. Viewers, from Dhaka to New Delhi, right up to US on the other side of the globe, questions are being raised all through the week about whether a section of the media is trying to whitewash terror, the intensity of terror worldwide, and how or why this compromises our fight against terror globally. So, the question on Media Scan this evening is a section of the media trying to whitewash terrorism worldwide. We are shortly going to connect to our special guest for the evening, but before that, a quick look at what we are actually trying to highlight here.
Three different incidents in three different countries. This has brought out the stark reality of how terror apologists can compromise the fight against terrorism worldwide. A section of the Western media tried to play down the brutal killings of Israeli hostages by Hamas. This despite the fact that the killings were videographed and circulated by the killer themselves. In our own neighborhood, a constant campaign is on to play down and gloss over the attacks on minorities, especially Hindus in Bangladesh. They're not only being killed, but a systematic effort is made to insult them publicly, force them to resign from their jobs, and terrorize them into submission or conversion. This week also witnessed the controversy over a web series based on the hijacking of IC-814 in 1999. OTT platform Netflix was summoned by the government to answer why it did not mention the real names of the hijackers and only their code names, which clearly hid the religion of the ISI-backed terrorists. Netflix relented and agreed to run a disclaimer giving out the real names of the hijackers. But the larger question still remains. Is a section of Western media and our own intelligentsia always looking out for excuses to whitewash terror? Well, that is a big question.
So, with that quick recap of the headlines through the week, I connect to our guest for the evening. Joining me this evening on Media Scan, Kanchan Gupta, Senior Advisor with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, an editor with a long-standing career. You have been listening to his views across platforms. Welcome, Kanchan Gupta. Namaskar. Also with us, Vamsi Juluri, well-known author, an expert on media studies, is a professor in the US currently in San Francisco. We are happy to have him on Media Scan. Namaskar, Vamsi. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And I'll come to Kanchan Gupta here first. Kanchanda, you were raising to us in a conversation just some minutes back about how the attack of Hamas and subsequently their chilling murders of some of the hostages, which they not only perpetrated the crime but actually videographed it and splashed it across platforms worldwide, and how a section of the US media, the Western media, was trying to play down the headlines. Why do you think this is being done, and does it help anybody's cause to water down crimes perpetrated by terrorists?
Thank you, Smita, for inviting me to your show. I just thought I would share some thoughts here.
Yes.
Now, since you mentioned the Israel-Palestine conflict, to be more specific, Israel-Gaza conflict, the latest headlines have been very, very upsetting. Now, as we all know, what Hamas is doing is to pick up one hostage a day or every few days, torture the hostage, kill the hostage, and then splash visuals across platforms, as you said. So recently there was this young Israeli, he was actually an American Israeli citizen who was taken hostage last October, and he was tortured. One of his arms was blown up, and then he was tortured, and then he was shot dead, and those videos and the visuals were circulated. The headline in CNN was, "Israeli hostage dies." Now, the Israeli hostage dies headline could mean anything. It could mean that he dies of starvation, he dies of disease, he dies of fever, or whatever. So, this kind of duplicity, and then of course, there was a lot of pushback, and those details were put in, were made public. And CNN, however, has not bothered to change its headline. It still remains what it was. Now, the CNN is just one such organization. If you look at all of Western media, their headlines are designed to be deceptive, their headlines are designed to be misleading, and this is premised on the ground that around the world, most of the readers or viewers, they look at headlines and they move on. They don't care to read the full text which follows. And even the full text in most of the cases is doctored and edited in a way that the grimness of the crime is sanitized.
Okay.
So that
Yes.
is where we are now, right now.
Yes, so I'll come to the good professor here. Vamsi, do you agree with what Kanchanda has flagged here about the fact that headlines are deceptive? They are often trying to water down the severity of terror, and most people do not care to read the full text. And even if they do, there is mischief in the copy as well.
Absolutely. I think if you want to intuit even a fraction of the truth, it's not enough to be just functionally literate these days in terms of being able to read and use a phone or turn on the TV. Put in all your attention, put in all your moral energy to simply peel away the layers of deception, as Kanchanda called it, that is being packed like a weapon into every letter, every word, every font, every little omission, decontextualization. That is the cruel circus that the Western media, most of the Western media, is playing today as far as its relationship to terrorism and violence goes. Yes, October 7th was a very important turning point. I was reminded of Samuel Huntington's essay and book, The Clash of Civilizations. In that, he prophesied in the 90s that while there was in the post-Cold War era, terrorism and cultural and civilizational conflicts were going to be a reality. He did have the hope that there was some kind of a basic universal morality common to all civilizations, whether it's the West or Islam or China, and everyone in the world would recognize murder as morally improper. But post October 7th, we are starting to see a shift, and a lot of it, I think, is related to the media and particularly the headline, because that is the level at which most engagement takes place.
Since
and
you
I
have
wanted
been
to share
writing about this, you are not only dealing with media studies as an academic, but you have been writing regularly on this. The basic question still remains, why do you think it is being done?
So I think the United States is a propaganda society. And in many ways, the broadest explanation I can give you is in the form of this very important book written by the French philosopher Jacques Ellul almost half a century ago, where he talks about modern society essentially as a propaganda society. And in the United States, the nature of propaganda has become so pervasive, particularly around the question of the American role as a global geopolitical power, that it is in the business essentially now of peddling fantasies about what's happening in other parts of the world, whether it's directly through the US intervention or through acts of omission. A quick example I wanted to read out, in terms of some of the headlines through which most Americans and much of American public opinion today is being shaped on a life and death situation in South Asia, in India, Bangladesh,
Quickly,
and so
please.
on.
Yes.
Yeah, very quickly. So if you look at the headlines in National Public Radio, there's not even one headline which really talks about the violence or leave alone terrorism. For example, after ousting Bangladesh's leader, Gen Z protesters are figuring out how to govern. Another headline says he was leading Bangladeshi student protests. Now he's a government minister. On a double-decker bus in Bangladesh's capital, people express hope for the future. So it's almost, there was a movie in the 60s directed by Richard Attenborough called Oh, What a Lovely War, which was a satire of war. It was an anti-war film. So it's almost like the Western media is selling this fantasy called, oh, what a lovely, peaceful, student-led democratic revolution.
I think
when in
that's
reality, they're
yes,
sanitizing terrorism.
Point taken, Vamsi, and this is a very interesting perspective, but also deeply concerning for us. And since you mentioned Bangladesh, I want to shift closer home and look at the incidents happening in Dhaka and across the length and breadth of Bangladesh. I'll come to Kanchan Gupta here, and I know that Kanchanda has a lot to share with us on this. But a very, very straight question, Dada, and that is Muhammad Yunus, the interim chief of the government, he gave an assurance publicly in a press conference that now that things were, things would be streamlined since an interim government had taken charge. And lately, he is on record to say that attacks on Hindu minorities are not of communal nature. His second statement says they are hugely exaggerated in the media. And even in his conversation with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he had assured of attacks going to be under control. And yet, every day we see more than one incident of lynching of young men, of women in government offices being insulted publicly, paraded through streets, people forced to tender their resignation. So, which means they are not only being attacked physically, but they are being completely isolated from the society and disempowered by forcing to resign, etc., on flimsy grounds. How do you look at headlines from the NYT, from various media platforms in the West? I have a string of them here, which started with the headline that these were revenge killings on Hindus, directly meaning to say, the corollary being that it was Hindus who must have perpetrated a whole lot of terror, for which they were now being revenged.
There are three parts to what you have said.
Yes.
One is what is actually happening on the ground in Bangladesh. And what is happening is now very clear. Now, some of it may be exaggerated, I don't dispute that. But in a situation where the government or the so-called interim government of Bangladesh itself has no control over the rest of the country, neither in terms of controlling the violence nor in terms of gathering accurate information. So in such a situation, there is bound to be a certain amount of fog, and the details may not always be as accurate as they should be. But having said that, even if you discount some of the content for exaggeration or not correct or whatever, the bulk of it does indicate and does show that that the minorities in Bangladesh are under huge attack, whether they be Hindus, Christians, or Buddhists. Now, the Hindus are the most visible minority in Bangladesh because numerically of the three, they are the largest. And all kinds of vengeance attacks are happening. And I am sorry to say this, that not all of them are vengeance attacks. They are also direct communal attacks. Now, there is a background to it. The Bangladesh interim government has released Islamists, including an Al-Qaeda-linked Islamist. The Jamaat-e-Islami ban has been lifted. The Hifazatul Islam is now operating as part of the so-called interim government. Now, in a situation like this, it is bound to happen that the minorities will be attacked. That is a reality. Now, coming to the second part.
I have a direct question
so the
here.
second part of
yes,
your question.
Yes, please make your point.
is the media response. Now, the media response has been to describe them, all these attacks, as revenge attacks. Now, revenge for what? There was an Awami League government in place, a legitimate Awami League government, and that government doesn't exist anymore. There would be people associated with that government. There would be teachers, doctors, whatever. You would also have voters. Now you cannot go around attacking them. That is not what Vamsi mentioned just now, a part of the moral society. And lastly, when you have public broadcasters like BBC, DW, and also mainstream Western media coming in with stories, including CNN, by the way, that these attacks are all exaggerated and nothing like this is happening, and that sort of validates what Muhammad Yunus, the so-called chief advisor in the interim government, his response is very shallow.
I will
And
ask you a direct question and then I'll move to Professor Jewelry here. Very directly, is Muhammad Yunus unable to control things because they are just out of his hands, or do you see a lack of intent?
see, let us put it this way. Bangladesh, I mean, just because the elected Awami League government has been evicted from office by resorting to violence, mass violence, does not mean that there is no support for the Awami League left in Bangladesh. So there will be conflict, there will be tension, and it is a test of the so-called interim government how best they are able to control it. But we are
Fair
not
enough.
here to
Yeah.
discuss
Fair enough.
Bangladesh
Fair enough.
affairs. We are talking about the media response.
Correct.
The media response. Now, the last point I would like to make, and I've shared it with you, Washington Post carried a full-page advertisement signed by Nobel laureates, Nobel Peace laureates, Nobel Science laureates, chemistry, physics, biology, you name it. Then all busybodies, prominent busybodies who keep on jetting from one conference to another, reading out their homilies. And the list begins with, interestingly, the former president of America, Barack Obama. Now, what they say in the advertisement, it's a gushing statement of appreciation for the manner in which the elected Bangladesh government has been evicted from office. They gloss over the fact that there is continuing violence, and there was massive violence even during the demonstrations. They call it peaceful and democratic, and they sort of make out that this is the way forward to change governments in countries. Now, they
Right,
won't allow
right.
it in their own country,
Yes.
but they are recommending this for the other countries.
Yes.
And,
I'll
and,
come
and
to
Washington Post
Vamsi here.
lives off their money. So obviously Washington Post will chip in by saying that nothing adverse is happening and all is fine.
Yes. Vamsi, very, very pertinent questions arising here out of what Kanchanda has flagged. I'll try to put them in a question briefly. First of all, it was a string of headlines I noticed which all celebrated the fall of Sheikh Hasina's government. Now, why should the Western media celebrate or not celebrate it? It's a matter of fact. It is not something for them to take sides, is a question. But let's say that was some weeks back. Now, this message that has come in the Washington Post, and then subsequently there is a chronology. The NYT says attacks on Hindus, if any, are revenge attacks. And then there are also headlines saying that there are elements in the Indian media who are trying to build up a narrative about attacks on Hindus in Bangladesh, which are not factual. Again, that's a very loaded kind of a headline. And finally, they blame India because, you know, some water was released from the dam, saying India deliberately caused floods. So there is a chronology to it. Altogether, it seems there is a cozy club going on between a section of the Western media and some of the some of the well-known in the intelligentsia there, who are trying to, give intellectual cover fire to the Muhammad Yunus government, even though it hasn't really come out, it's come out in much of glory yet.
Yeah, even this rationalization they're attempting by saying that these attacks are not communal or interreligious in nature, but they're just because of political reasons. How are they even able to justify that with a straight face? After all, some of the people in America were claiming that the incidents that happened on their capital on January 6th were worse than 9/11, quote unquote. That is what some Democratic politicians were saying. So in any case, many Americans, particularly in the ruling establishment right now, pride themselves on being very, democratic people. So they don't like people who question even a democratic result. So how come they're, quite okay, or they want us to believe it's okay if these attacks are somehow not religious in nature but political in nature, as they claim? I think it's a very, very specious claim. But anyway, so there's double standards. It's badly harming America's image around the world and domestically. I think the bigger issue in the US, because see, I've been teaching for 30 years and I love teaching my students the importance of using the media as a productive tool, a tool that's important in democracy for the future of the world. But then most of the time goes into training our students how to not get fooled by the media.
So
because
what do you think about the fact raised by Kanchan Gupta that things which happen in countries in other continents, which the Western media likes to promote so much, like street protests and coups and people changing regimes, which it suddenly changes track when it comes to happenings in their own backyard?
Yeah, exactly. So it's this is the old imperial, or if I may use an even stronger word, it is the old racist baggage in America, regardless of whether it's left or right. Because after all, post Obama, we are supposed to be looking at a very progressive left or liberal regime, and yet they have no respect for democracy. They have double standards domestically and abroad. And most importantly, again, to go back to the core issue, the way they're whitewashing religious bigotry, religious violence, like that poor boy Mandal, who was beaten, I don't know, to death or nearly to death, in Bangladesh recently. And there have been so many more incidents. And I wanted to share one, real life experience that I had the privilege of witnessing about a week ago. There was a small group of students at the University of California, Berkeley, who organized a silent vigil last weekend. And they were Bangladeshi Hindus there, actual Bangladeshi Hindu people who came, and they spoke about the long history of the persecution of Hindus, the fact that demographically you could call it a genocide. They spoke about horrifying crimes against Hindu women there, the refugee crisis, the challenges they faced while trying to come to India. And another, Bangladeshi Hindu gentleman spoke of his family, how they're in hiding, they're having to erase their marks and, their religious identity.
Yes.
So it is a crisis of religious persecution against Hindus and other minority religions that's going on.
We don't have much time left. I want to come quickly to Kanchan Gupta here for a related question. How do these headlines, this particular slant of the media trying to either water down or black out violence, does it and how does it compromise our fight against religious bigotry and terror worldwide?
It does impact how governments frame their policy. And it's a strange feeding system. One feeds into the other. Now, if you have the Western media, if you look at it, for terrorist attacks in the West, in Europe, for instance, we suddenly started seeing terms like knife attack, car attack, truck attack. I mean, these were terrorist attacks using knives as a weapon, or this was, in some parts of Europe, like in France. Now they would not describe this as an act of terror. And as a consequence, because they would not, because that would offend the left liberal sensitivity over there, they then started framing policies which were ineffective. And
Yes.
in a sense, they are much more vulnerable today than we are. We are a big country. We can, and we have been absorbing losses, and yet we can be where we are. Now, whether it is in terms of the economy, whether it's in terms of science and research, whether it's in terms of sheer geopolitics, we will be there. But look at all the European countries. Their populations are a fraction of our population. Look
Yes.
at America. Their population is much less than our population.
I,
How
I,
many
I'll come to
losses?
I'll come to
How
Vamsi
many
here quickly.
losses will they be able to absorb? They
Correct.
won't.
And they are also coming out on the streets. We have seen in Belgium and Germany and the UK and even France, the concern is growing in the society. Vamsi, very quickly, in few seconds, do you think the language of the media, the treatment of their stories affects policy making?
Absolutely. Language is the most important front line of propaganda, persuasion, psyops. George Orwell wrote so much about language in 1984, and we are witnessing what's happening. It's a dangerous cycle where the policymakers who are profiting of wars and interventions and regime changes around the world, are leading the media. They've compromised the journalists. A very quick chronological example I want to give you. In the 60s, when the US went into Vietnam, claiming to liberate Vietnam and protect from communism, the universities and the media questioned it. By 2003, when the Iraq war happened on the false premise of WMDs, the media went along with it, but the universities still questioned it. Today, neither universities nor media in America are questioning, because the peace movement, the progressive movement, has been co-opted by corporate statist
Yes.
interests.
I'm afraid I'll have to stop you here, Professor Jalluri. But thank you to both of you gentlemen, Kanchan Gupta, for connecting to us at such a short notice, and Vamsi Jalluri connecting with us at not a very convenient hour. But both of you gentlemen have been very helpful in taking us through this very sensitive subject. Thank you very much. Viewers, just as our guests have explained in some detail, when headlines try to water down and scale down the extent of terror across the world, it does not just remain to the headlines. It affects the society, it affects government's response to terror, and eventually it is people all over the world who have to bear the brunt of this violence. So, if the media is not ready to correct itself, perhaps we, the consumers of news, have to become more judicious in our reading and following of news. On that serious note, it's a wrap up on Media Scan for this weekend. Do join us next weekend for another topic of national importance. Till then, namaskar.